Should you buy an apartment in a smaller boutique building? We'll demystify this topic in the following video. My name is Chris at HouseSet. Generally speaking, no. We believe the cons outweigh the pros when it comes to smaller boutique buildings. Not only will you have fewer neighbors to share expenses, liabilities, and any unexpected surprises with, but the impact of any crazy neighbors is supersized, as though much more likely be on the board. Furthermore, a smaller building typically means fewer competent candidates with the free time, desire, or capability to volunteer for the board. On the other hand, apartments in boutique buildings are more rare, and the privacy and the exclusivity that comes from living in a smaller building tends to help boost valuations. As a result, if you want to avoid the mega towers and live in a more intimate setting, we highly recommend buying an apartment in a smaller building, but with one caveat: don't buy in a building that's too small. We think the sweet spot is a building that has more than 10 units, but less than 30 or so units. Larger share of any building expenses or liabilities. One of the biggest risks to buying an apartment in a smaller boutique building is the fact that you'll be responsible for a greater proportion of any building-wide expenses or liabilities. Whereas in a larger apartment building with, let's say, 100 or 200 plus units, you typically won't have to worry about being, say, unable to afford a hefty surprise condo or co-op special assessment. Well, that's due to the sheer number of neighbors you'd get to split any bills with. In a smaller building, however, you might only have, say, 10 or under 10 or under 20 units total with whom to split costs with. That can be quite scary for a large assessment. Boutique buildings are typically defined as condo, co-op, condo-op, or rental apartment buildings with 20 or fewer apartment units. Now, everything is expensive in New York, so if you're buying an apartment in a smaller building in NYC, you need to understand that everything from labor to parts to materials can be prohibitively expensive in New York. Contractors typically blindly assume that you're filthy rich just because you own an apartment in Manhattan or Brooklyn, and they won't hesitate to give you arbitrary quotes seemingly out of thin air simply because there's a chance that a wealthy New Yorker won't blink and won't bother bargaining at all. It does happen. City violations can be expensive to remedy. When it comes to money, New York City's various government agencies can cause some serious damage to property owners. For example, a boutique condo with 10 units that fails a local law 11 inspection and has their building rated unsafe will face an enormous amount of headache and monetary loss. Not only will the building have to pay thousands per month to rent a scaffolding immediately to prevent any injuries to pedestrians from falling bricks, masonry, and other materials in the building, but the building will have to spend hundreds of thousands or perhaps even millions to repair the facade. If the building happens to be landmarked, prepare for an even bigger bill and an even longer time to complete any facade repairs. The LPC is known for requiring bureaucratic approval for any minute changes to the exterior of a landmarked building. How fun do you think this will be for you if you only have 9 other neighbors to share the cost of this massive bill and this debacle with? Fewer people to volunteer for the board. Fewer neighbors means fewer competent, willing, and honest people who might be open to serving on the condo or co-op board. This can actually be a serious issue, especially in luxury boutique condominiums where all the owners are presumably very busy with their jobs or otherwise preoccupied. As you can imagine, it can be very hard to find an owner who's willing to devote serious time and attention to the job of being a board member. The worst case scenario is a board composed of unwilling board members who don't pay any attention to what's going on in the building at all. In this situation, you may have a managing agent that essentially has total control of what happens in the building, and an unresponsive board that essentially rubber stamps anything that the managing agent suggests. This is an extremely dangerous situation to be in, as it can lead to costs spiraling out of control. Remember that the managing agent isn't paid more if the building saves money. So there's little incentive, if you think about it, for a managing agent to fight to keep costs low and down. As a result, a managing agent that goes unsupervised by a board would typically make a low effort, or perhaps even no effort, in soliciting multiple competitive quotes for a big job, meaning that all owners end up overpaying. Furthermore, a managing agent may not make an effort to dispute rate increases from vendors and service providers, for example, building accountants, and essentially push the board to approve all rate increases without bothering to push back on the vendor or to even solicit new quotes. Crazy neighbors have an outsized impact. Living in a small building means any crazy neighbors you might have will have an outsized impact on not only day-to-day life in the building, but how the building is run. The impact of a crazy neighbor in a small building cannot be overstated, especially if this crazy neighbor is involved in building politics and is in a position of power. For example, having one crazy neighbor in a 10-unit building versus a 100-unit building is infinitely worse, because the crazy neighbor is much likelier, first of all, to be elected to the board in the smaller building. Furthermore, it's hard to avoid being impacted by a crazy person in a smaller building versus a larger building where they can be avoided. A crazy person on the board means corruption or even litigation. A crazy neighbor gaining a board seat in your boutique building might lead to self-dealing, corruption, and even litigation in your small building. It's fairly common for a crazy neighbor serving on the board to have no sense of what's right or wrong, and to essentially self-deal to the detriment of everyone else in the building. Perhaps because they believe they deserve to be compensated for serving on the board, even though they volunteered. A classic example is a board president who insists on overpaying a part-time super a salary of, let's say, $20,000 a year just to spend a few hours each week taking out the garbage. Now, that's above market rate. Why would the board president do this when the average wage for a part-time super with very limited responsibilities is only $5,000 a year? Perhaps because he or she utilizes the part-time super as a personal handyman and frequently calls upon the super at all times for personal favors without telling anyone else how much he or she is using the part-time super. Essentially, the board president has co-opted the building's part-time super as his or her personal servant. In a similar vein, a corrupt and crazy board member might actually take kickbacks from contractors who overcharge the building for major or very large jobs. For example, the board president illegally pockets a cash kickback of $25,000 on a $100,000 roof repair job that should have only cost $50,000. The board president pushed for and picked the higher cost contractor because, unbeknownst to everyone else in the building, he was getting a secret referral fee, probably in cash. Lastly, it's important to remember that all of this craziness usually ends up in litigation once other neighbors discover the extent of the treachery. This leads to the building suing people and neighbors suing each other, all of which are terrible for the building's finances and can lead to units being unfinanceable or unsaleable. Rarity can result in higher valuations. A rare upside of buying an apartment in a smaller boutique building is that you won't have hundreds of competing units to deal with when it comes time to sell. By default, your unit will be rare because there may be many years in between when units in your building come to the market for sale. And when units do come to the market, they usually are the only listing in their building. This is especially true if your boutique building is in a coveted or historic neighborhood, such as the West Village, or the Meatpacking District, or Tribeca, or Soho. In fact, you're most likely to find boutique buildings in Lower Manhattan neighborhoods such as the West Village, like we mentioned, Soho, Meatpacking District, Tribeca, and the Lower East Side. There might also be a lift in valuations due to the intimacy and privacy that comes from living in a smaller building. The privacy that comes from a smaller number of people in a building tends to lend an air of exclusivity, which in itself can lend perceived value and increase the valuation of an apartment. So there you have it. We hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please hit like or subscribe. We do come out with content on a regular basis. If you have a comment, please leave it below or email us, team@houseit.com. And of course, you can visit our website, www.houseit.com. If you're buying or selling property in New York, we can help you save up to 2% on the buy side and up to all 6% on the sell side in broker commissions when you buy or sell. Again, my name is Chris at Houseit. We're the largest assisted FSBO and buyer agent commission rebate company in New York City, established in 2014. And we'll see you on the next one.